evening and welcome back to the Mars Hill House of Intellectual Discourse. I'm Joshua Johnson and we're continuing in our study of Rethinking Reality, going through the dialogues of Hylas and Philonous by George Berkeley in order to understand the thought of Jonathan Edwards. And we just concluded the last dialogue, the first dialogue, well, yeah, the last one we did, but yeah, the first dialogue of Hylas and Philonous, which is the longest of the three. And it's where Berkeley is really laying the groundwork for some of his main goals, which are going to be coming about in the second and third dialogues, which get to his theistic arguments, as well as his pretty much eradicating skepticism and atheism from view, which is really his ultimate goal in developing the system, which is a goal very similar to Jonathan Edwards. And so before we get into the second dialogue, which won't be tonight, we're going to take an intermission from the typical pattern, and we're going to actually jump into Jonathan Edwards a little bit. We're going to be reading some of his stuff off camera, and then we're going to be discussing it afterwards, and discussing questions and bringing up, okay, well, what did he think? Is this consistent with what we know about Jonathan Edwards, which is typically his theological leanings. Most people these days know Jonathan Edwards because of John Piper, who's a very popular theologian right now, and because he's sort of like the father of the new Calvinism movement. And because of his strong ties with Jonathan Edwards and his liking of Jonathan Edwards' ideas, Jonathan Edwards has overall become very popular, but mostly on the theological side and not so much on the philosophical side. It's typically because people are ignorant of it. They don't really know what Jonathan Edwards believed philosophically. His works were limited to a few different philosophical works, and the rest of it was kind of scattered through his theology. So tonight we're going to stop and we're going to get into Edwards, because I don't want to, even though this study is using Berkeley as a stepping stone to understand Edwards, we want to still keep Edwards in sight. We still want to be able to stop and say, okay, well, does Edwards agree with this? And that's basically what we're doing. We're going to compare Edwards' thoughts in relation to the first dialogue. Does he agree with the central premises that the world is idea, that it's mental content revealed from God to our minds? But generally speaking, it's mostly going to be focusing on, well, does he believe that sensations are in the mind, that perceptual objects are in the mind? What does this mean? Does he have an answer to this? How does he explain it? Does it line up with what we have already studied in Berkeley for the past however many studies we've had? So that's going to be our focus tonight. But first we're going to review from last week, so we have fresh in our minds what was finished off. And what that was Hylas' last stand. That was what I labeled it on the board last week. And in Hylas' last stand, we see that Philonous has finally got Hylas where he wants him. And this really came about when Hylas was like, okay, well, I've granted you all this so far, but I'm going to revert a little bit here. And now I'm going to start throwing out some objections just I have. Anything I can... You can imagine someone being in the kitchen, they've lost an argument, they have nothing else to cling to. Almost actually, if a burglar was coming in, they're out of ammo with their gun. They throw the gun at them. Their knife's broke, so then they're starting to throw dishes out of the cupboard. That's basically what Hylas is doing. He's no longer got the ammunition that he's had in the past and arguing with Philonous, so now he's basically throwing everything out of the cupboards, throwing everything out of the sink, whatever he can do to get away from this guy. And Philonous is cold, calm, and collected. And he, just bit by bit, finishes off these last objections and concludes with, you're a skeptic. So there's three things that were discussed last week. The burden of proof was the first one. Does anybody remember what this objection was on the part of Hylas?
Hylas said that he was the one who had to, that Philonous was the one who had to prove that his was the true thing, and then right. Philonous pretty much laughs in his face and says, why me, when you're the one who doesn't even have an argument and you've given up half of yours?
Yeah. Well, it's actually even more than that. What was so strong about Philonous' response to Hylas, because that's what, you're right, Hylas did start out by saying, well, you need to prove to me, you need to concretely prove to me that the world is nothing but mental content. Okay? But Philonous knows how argument works, and he knows how logic works. And of course he's echoing Berkeley. And what the burden of proof is in this segment is that Philonous actually turns the table right around on Hylas. He says, now actually, if you want to use the laws of reason, the laws of debate that are universally accepted, you're the one with the burden of proof. You're the one making a positive claim. You can't prove a negative. So for instance, and this is, even atheists and theists will admit this when they're in their debates with one another, typically in modern debates with modern presuppositions, that the theist has the burden of proof. Why are all these proofs for God? Because theists have understood that we're making a positive claim that there exists God. That's a positive statement. Atheism is making a negative statement. There is no God. You can't prove a negative, and atheists would even admit that. Typically because if you were to prove that there was no God, you'd actually be God, because that would mean you were omniscient. And most atheists know this issue. And so they can't prove that God does not exist. So what they say is, we have seen no proofs that are adequate to assume that position, that positive position. So the burden of proof is on the one making the positive claim. Now, how does that apply with this? Well, Philemus is not making a positive claim. He's not saying that something exists. He's saying that something does not exist. What does not exist is mind-independent stuff and matter. He's saying he's making a negative statement. And so Hylas is saying, well, you need to prove to me that these things don't exist. And Philemus is like, that's a joke. Flips it right back around, says, actually, you're the one with the burden of proof. Now, obviously, because Hylas has conceded so much already, he's already been put into a corner, and he's already can't answer that. As soon as that table's turned on him, it was done on that point. Now, the other one was the active versus passive. Does anybody remember that?
I thought that was the study before that.
No, it was this last study.
Was?
Pretty sure. Well, if not, even so, it's good to review these, because these are some of his last-ditch arguments, and I think they're really good because they're really going to get into, especially in studying Edwards, this issue is going to be very important.
Well, he said that there's active perceiving and passive perceiving, because he said that there's, well, Hylas said that you're actively perceiving it, but there's like this passive stuff underneath that you're...
Well, okay, let me explain. Okay, in the active versus passive, Hylas was trying to say, well, color's actually on the flower, and I actually am actively getting the color into my mind. So it's like an action. I'm actively sensing something. And Philemus responds and says, well, no, that's ridiculous, because in reality, when you perceive a flower, you can't help what the colors are coming in. You're actually passive in that. Like when you open your eyes, can you help what you see? Now you can actively open or close your eyes, but when you open your eyes, you're not actively sensing. You're receiving that information. I am not actively making brownness appear to myself. I'm passive in that. It's coming into me. It's like you open the floodgates when you open your eyes and all this stuff comes in. All the colors, all the shapes, all everything. And then of course you interpret it with your mind, and there you go. Now, so that's one. Now there were some other objections too in the last study and the study before that were pretty much fairly ridiculous. Like, okay, does distance imply mind independence? Okay, I perceive stars far away off. Now he's already concluded that everything you see is in the mind. So if I see stars far off, that must imply that there's something mind independent. But you're seeing them, aren't you? If you have a dream and you see stars, they look distant in your dreams. Are you saying that those are in your mind then? The stars in your dreams? Well, of course not. Well, then why would you say that about outside of your dreams? And then, so that's those types of objections I'm not really getting into too much. The other one was one that our friend Jared here had some really good questions about last study that were excellent, was about representational realism, which was, okay, well, he had a hard time understanding, well, if our images are in the mind of extension, like if I'm going towards a building, it starts out looking smaller, gets larger, larger, larger as I get close. Okay, why can't that represent an object that has a fixed objective extension? That was a very awesome, an awesome discussion. I really enjoyed it. And in that discussion, what we saw was that what Hylas was talking about, he wasn't talking about anything that we can really comprehend. So with any of the sensations, like for instance, color, he admitted the color's in the mind. Okay, so a representation, okay, is color. So we'll say this one's red. Okay, so you have a representation of a red chair. Okay, well in reality, it's representing a real chair, real, that means mind independent according to Hylas, and but the chair has no color. He says, oh, color's in the mind, but the color is representing non-color. That's basically the conclusion. And finalist says, well, that's ridiculous. Now, similarly with extension, we only know of extension by our experience of size in that fluctuation from our approaching of it. So if size was actually in the object and our fluctuating images was representing something that's fixed, that wouldn't make sense. Because are you saying that our visual perception, it basically you have to say that our visual perception has no correspondence to reality, just like colors have no correspondence to the way things really are. So really, colors and extension and hot and cold represent things that have no temperature or no feeling of temperature, no actual extension, and no color. How is that a representation? That's really what it was. How can you say that's a representation at all? It's really skepticism. And that's really what was, once this was concluded, that's really what put Hylas in. Hylas was a skeptic. He's saying, I have these perceptual objects, I know not from where they come. They're in my mind, I have no idea how they got there. And that's Berkeley's point. Berkeley speaking through Hylas is trying to make Hylas a skeptic. He's trying to say, okay, everything's in the mind. He's talking specifically to Hylas' mind. Everything's in your mind. You have no idea where it came from. That's what we got to see when we're going to get into this, to the reason, the essential importance for God in all this. Berkeley is through Hylas is basically saying, you must be a skeptic. All of reality is mental, and you, no clue. No clue where it's from. And you can't come up with any kind of basis for it. And it's almost, it reminds me of sort of like a presuppositional argument, for any of you who are familiar with that apologetic. It's really showing the person that if they think that they're on a train going to Boston. They really do think that. But you're showing them that their ticket actually says, no, you're going to Chicago. And that's, Hylas thought that he had it. He knew what he was doing with his position. And all that Hylas did was show him from his own position where his conclusions actually led him. He showed him, it's like, okay, what do you there's all questions. Do you agree that redness is in the object? And then through discussion, it shows them through different arguments, no, it must be in the mind. So all this time, Hylas was holding to these conceptions, and he was incorrect. He was inconsistent with his own presuppositions. And Berkeley, through Hylas, has basically pointed this out, and now Hylas is like, I'm a skeptic. Church bell rings, and then the first dialogue is over. And so that's our review. Any questions on what was discussed? So, but real quick, just to get a broad review, since we'll be discussing Edwards, Berkeley's thesis so far is this, that all things perceived exist in the mind. Now, he's not talking about, like, my head. He's talking about they're mental. They exist in our conscious awareness. So, which, in his time especially, that's referring to the soul. That's referring to that aspect of our being. And so, when we talk about that chair, it's, green and brown. It's quite hideous, actually. But it's, that colors, the hardness, the odor that it might have, all these different things cannot be in the object or in the mind. And if each individual sensation is in the mind, if I remove all those sensations, what would I have left of the chair? Nothing. And that's really some of the interesting arguments that have been presented. And so I wanted to make that very clear, because when we get into Edwards, we're going to analyze and see, does Edwards agree with this? Does he agree that the world as we perceive it exists in the mind? That's what we're going to do tonight. It's going to be a short study, but it's going to be enjoyable to really make that connection between these two thinkers. Both clergy, both philosophers, both reacting against atheism and skepticism. All right, we're back. We just went through some reading of some stuff from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, as well as through sections in Jonathan Edwards' The Mind, to basically come to the conclusion whether or not Edwards' philosophical system has any relationship to that of Berkeley's. Are they saying the same things? Are they in agreement with one another? Can we confirm this? And would you guys agree that it seems like Edwards and Berkeley are on the same page?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I wanted to, some of the things that we discussed, I want to quote real quick. There's 3 quotes here from Jonathan Edwards, just to have it on camera since we discussed it already. These are some of his most clear statements. Nothing has existence anywhere else but either in created or uncreated consciousness. He also says, the material universe exists only in the mind. The existence of all corporeal things is only ideas. And those from his different works of Being, the Mind, and Miscellanies. Now, we went through a ton of quotes from his work, The Mind, in discussing some other different relationships that this has. Okay, what does that have to the mind of God? We only covered a little bit because I didn't want to get too much into it, because I want to save some of that for when we get more into Berkeley. But I wanted to ask your feelings on it. What are some of your reactions to this? Like, how do you feel about what Edwards is saying? Does it bother you? Are you interested in it?
Well, I said before, it kind of blows my mind. Just how God is sovereign over everything. Mm-hmm. And so this whole philosophy is a way of kind of tying that into, Calvinism into our everyday lives in a way where God is sovereign over everything.
Everything. What do you think?
I don't know.
You agree?
Of course I agree.
But yeah, it's I think really important to see that when Edwards speaks and when Berkeley speaks of looking at an object, it's not looking at it as something that's sustaining its own existence. It's not there by itself. It's not there under some natural process. It really is a continuously, in a sense, continuously created, continuously revealed to the mind thing. It's something that, in fact, it's even almost inappropriate to call it a thing. It's God revealing himself. So when I see a tree, I should say, God is magnifying himself to me at this particular moment. Give praise to him. This is why, it's really significant to remember that, especially with Berkeley, when he's using these arguments that, at first he's not using a lot of scripture, he's not using a lot of theological jargon, probably because they both are Christian in the book. But Berkeley is a clergyman. He was a bishop in the Anglican Church. And Jonathan Edwards was a Congregationalist minister and a Puritan. These men were men of God. They feared God. They, were dedicated to the Scriptures, and they were reacting to the same person. Now, one of the things that's said here in this article too is Edwards' arguments for idealism are similar to, but apparently uninfluenced by, Berkeley. This gets brought up because the systems are very similar. But if you look at the data, you can see why. Berkeley and Edwards were clergymen. They both read the same people. They both read Malebranche. They both read John Locke. They both knew the different skeptical arguments. In fact, Jonathan Edwards had a little bit of an edge on Berkeley. Apparently, he not only read David Hume, but maybe have even articulated a response to objections Hume had towards Berkeley's system. In fact, he dialogued with different ministers in Scotland on the issue. It's a very big thing to think about. The Edwards may actually have had a good direction to take Western thought in that it didn't go in. Because Hume, of course, influenced Immanuel Kant, who is arguably the father of Western thought, which is really skepticism in a great degree. Immanuel Kant read David Hume. David Hume supposedly refuted Berkeley, and he said, well, David Hume awoke me from my dogmatic slumbers. It's a quote from Immanuel Kant. And that's when Kant developed his entire system, which was not nearly as skeptical as Hume, but then it led to the foundations of all the skepticism we have now, which is not that all is mental, God reveals mental, but it's my mind that makes reality, my personal mind that makes my reality. And so you have no basis, you have no idea what's out there, whether God exists, whether there's matter. I have sensations coming in, my mind makes reality out of the sensations, I know not what's out there. Really what Kant's conclusions lead to, because of his response to Hume. But if Edwards already had a response to Hume in defense of his system, who knows? If they would have read Edwards, where would we be today? It's hard to say. I'm sure Edwards would like to think it would be his post-millennial utopia, but it's hard to imagine. It's not the way, of course, that God decreed it to happen. But other things that were said, too, is that Edwards deals with some objections. And I'm going to cover a little bit of these because I don't think Berkeley gets into them particularly. One is, well, if I'm sensing, and I'm sensing through my nose. I mean, I can feel my nose doing the work, and then I have this sense of odor. Well, how can one perceptual object, that is my nose, mediate for another perceptual event, like is this, the odor of a rose? If they're both in the mind, how can one be the cause of the other, or vice versa? And Edwards' response is simple. He goes, God is so ordained that when you have a quiver or twitch in your nose, that will be followed by the odor coming in of the rose itself. So you have that correlation between the nose and the smell of the rose. It's a strong correlation because that's how God so ordained it. And he rationally explains the issue. It says, no, you don't have to say, okay, well, if they're both in the mind, how can they causally relate to each other? Because they don't. The correlation is fixed, it's determined from outside of yourself. And these things are going to be not addressed in that same way, but Berkeley is going to be getting into some really interesting arguments along the same line in the dialogues. Likewise, Edwards deals with other different types of questions that really correlate with Berkeley. Another one was like pain in the pin. We've discussed this several times in various studies, but Berkeley would say that, okay, you will say that when the pin renders and divides the flesh, that pain is in the pin, that pain that you feel. So why will you say that heat is in the fire if heat is indistinguishable from pain? When you see fire damaging your flesh, heat or pain isn't in the fire, it's in your mind. Just like pain is not in the pin. Edwards says almost the exact same thing when he uses the word needle. He goes, just like color's in the mind, no one will say that pain is in the needle if it pricks your finger. Now, I mean, that might call into question whether there really was no influence from Berkeley on Edwards. I mean, there's a very good possibility this might just be a coincidence and common illustration. But there's and I wanted to bring this up too. I might have discussed this in our very first study, but because I have some people here that may not have been there for that study, I'm going to mention some of these possible relationships. Jonathan Edwards went to Yale. That's where he was educated very early. So he was in his teens when he went. And when he was at Yale, there was a controversy involving some of the leaders at Yale turning Episcopalian or Anglican, which in Congregationalist Puritan New England was a big no-no. So, but these men end up leaving, and then Edwards, because of his prominence as a student and his intellect, was pretty much left in charge. He was a tutor, and tutors had a lot of power at Yale. And so when these men left over this Episcopalian controversy, you have Jonathan Edwards taking over the library. In fact, that was some of the way that he impressed Sarah Pierpont's father, who would be his, Sarah would be his future bride. Because he was in charge of the library, he was expanding Yale's library with books from his own personal library. He was getting involved with other people getting books in, and a lot of people were donating books, and he was managing this whole thing. Now, let's set that aside. Let's go to Berkeley's angle. Berkeley came to the United States. Now, this is, of course, not the United States, it was colonial America at the time. And he stayed at a place, I think it was around Rhode Island, called Whitehall. And while he was there, he met a man from the very colony of Jonathan Edwards. From Connecticut, there was a Congregationalist minister named Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson adopted the philosophy of George Berkeley and taught it in the Americas. He became the first president of King's College. He converted from Congregationalism to Episcopalianism, which was the same as Berkeley. Now, this doesn't ring any bells. Samuel Johnson actually did some work at Yale, where Edwards was at. And if you remember, Edwards ascended to his position because ministers, Congregationalists and Puritans, were becoming Episcopalian. One such man that was involved in all this during that same exact time period was Samuel Johnson, who wrote a book on Berkeley's philosophy, Noetica e Ethica, so on the mind and ethics, which was a defense of Berkeley's system. In fact, it had ideas that weren't in Berkeley but were in Edwards, that our ideas are types of the God's archetypes, stuff that I've only seen in Edwards, not in Berkeley, but Samuel Johnson wrote about it. Another interesting correlation. Furthermore, Berkeley donated almost all of his library to Yale. Now, who was managing the library and working correlation with Yale for all these years afterwards? None other than Jonathan Edwards, who frequently spoke at Yale. Likewise, in the same colony, it was a huge controversy to have Congregationalist ministers turn Episcopalian. It is highly unlikely that Jonathan Edwards did not know of Samuel Johnson, leaving Congregationalism and becoming an Episcopalian. This man who was a Berkeleyan philosopher. So why would have Edwards not cited Berkeley or Samuel Johnson if he was influenced by him? Probably because of the heated nature of the debates at the time. Basically everybody's off with the heads of these Episcopalians and Anglicans that were apostates from Congregationalism. And if Edwards is using half their philosophy, maybe he was worried that his system would be called into question because he was borrowing ideas from these Episcopalians. Very likely, but that's how close the correlation is. Same colony, you have Berkeleyan thought occurring. There are books being donated to the institutions Edwards was affiliated with. What's going on? Very interesting. So, and plus you see the examples and the statements that Edwards uses. It's sometimes hard to imagine that he wasn't influenced by Berkeley in some way. But because there's no paper trail, no definite citation, we can't say that they were definitely influenced. But I would say that there's a strong case to be made that there may have been. But even if there wasn't, they're both clergy, both read Locke, responded to John Locke's materialism. So they could have developed independently. So it's either way would make perfect sense. Any questions on that? Any questions about Edwards' views? Just in general, like how does this relate to creation? How does this relate to anything? I'm sure a million questions could probably be asked on a lot of different things, but
it's kind of random to just pop it up.
I don't know where to start.
Yeah. Well, like I said, this is just going to be a short study, just getting into Edwards a little bit, and we did. And I think that we can conclude pretty concretely that Edwards definitely shares the thought of George Berkeley. I mean, ultimately, that was our goal tonight, was to take this section just to stop and say, okay, what has Berkeley established in the first dialogue? He established that all things exist in the mind. Does Edwards agree with them? Yes. I think without a shadow of a doubt. But now, Edwards and Berkeley agree on, okay, how does this necessitate the existence of God? We touched on it a little bit tonight, but will they agree on how this is demonstrated? Will they agree on the nature of creation? How do you explain creation in all this? How do you explain the problem of evil? The nature of the human will? These are some important questions. They get brought up in the next two dialogues. Because now, you get the groundwork, now we're going to start getting into, because these men both claim to be Christians, they're going to get into questions from Scripture, doctrinal questions, theological questions, as well as philosophical questions. The queen and king of the sciences were philosophy and theology and classical studies. And so you'll see these two being referred to constantly. And so it's going to be very interesting. Another question is how they both view science. Okay, well, if you throw out matter and a mind-independent reality, does it make sense to do science? What's the basis for induction? Making inductive inferences, doing experiments, probability, natural laws. There's a lot of questions that need to be asked. Some things that we discussed during the reading. Miracles. How do you view miracles in this? Are they no longer miraculous? Or are they miraculous yet rational? Those are all important questions as well. Causation. If a ball strikes another ball, is it the ball that causes the other ball to move? Or what is that? What's going on when that happens? Some really interesting things that we're going to get into. And of course, ultimately I think our goal is, okay, well, that's all well and good, but does this prove Christian theism as opposed to Islam? What's unique about this? Is there something unique about this that will bring us back to a Christian position as opposed to any of these other theistic positions? A lot of things to cover. Some really interesting arguments. And this was a very good study. Thanks for coming, and see you next time.